A chocolate manufacturer needed more accurate costs to make sure their pricing was appropriate and to identify weaknesses in their product range and identify opportunities for improving efficiency and profitability. They asked us to undertake an activity-based costing exercise to assist them with the allocation of nearly $4 million of overhead. Here we consider the application of ABC to a subset of just 4 product lines. Step 1 was to identify the main activities linked to these products, which were determined by watching the business in action and talking to employees about what they do. Activity incurs costs, and having a list of activities helps us allocate costs to product lines based on cause-effect relationships. From this analysis, we identified 4 key activities that affect the indirect manufacturing costs in different ways depending on the different products. Step 2 involves creating cost pools by allocating the total overhead of just under $4 million to the 4 activity areas we identified in Step 1. This allocation was based on how and where the indirect manufacturing costs were incurred. For example, warehouse lease costs and storage refrigeration costs were allocated to the storage and warehousing cost pool. In Step 3, we need to establish what causes the activity costs within the cost pools to be incurred. These cost drivers are the events that happen that drive or cause costs, and will help us allocate the costs accurately to particular product lines. For purchasing and inbound logistics, every time a purchase order or delivery of raw materials happens, it will take time and effort to process and move the materials around. So the more orders that are placed and the more deliveries that arrive, the greater the level of cost. These costs will be allocated based on which product lines require the most orders and deliveries. Storing materials and finished goods is expensive, and so counting the days that materials or finished goods are stored on pallets is a good way of systematically measuring the cost. The product lines that require the most storage will end up being allocated more overhead based on the storage consumed. With production and packaging, the number of operating hours is the cost driver, because as the number of hours the production process runs for increases, so too do indirect costs such as power and water, cleaning, and machinery repairs and maintenance. Sales and outbound logistics costs are also incurred in a similar way to purchasing and inbound logistics. The number of sales orders, transactions, and outbound deliveries are cost drivers here. Once we know what is causing the costs, we need to count how often these activities or drivers occur. This takes a long time and involves observation, reviewing documents, and talking with employees. Once we have these numbers, we can work out the cost per event or transaction. First, we divide each activity cost pool by the total number of cost driver transactions. This gives us the transaction cost rate for each activity. This cost rate is what we use to allocate indirect costs to the specific product lines. For Step 6, we need the number of cost driver transactions that occur for each of our 4 product lines. Using this information, we allocate the indirect costs to each product based on the number of cost driver transactions. As you can see, only $1.8 million in overhead has been allocated to these 4 product lines. Note that the remaining $2.1 million in overhead would be allocated to other product lines. For Step 7, we can divide the allocated indirect product costs by the number of units produced to obtain the overhead allocation per unit. But beware, you haven't finished yet. This is only the indirect unit cost. We also need to combine this with the direct costs to calculate the total product cost. To recap, the purpose of ABC is to find out important cause-effect relationships so that we can allocate our indirect costs more accurately. This will mean our total product cost will be more accurate, because costs have been allocated based on how each product line consumes particular activities, rather than just being spread out across all products in a more random fashion, which can occur when using traditional overhead cost allocation methods. Better costing information will lead to better decision making in many areas, including cost control, pricing, and product mix choices.